What's going on? Boys, arm yourselves. We are talking about a few things today. Mainly neediness and taking the bait. Because your neediness makes you submissive and baitable. I was in my little secret, sneaky spot outside work today, waiting on the eclipse, when out of nowhere, psychopath ENTJ in the flesh pops in on me. And he's talking at me buddy buddy, despite everything that's gone on. And he was talking at me in a way I would find very palatable, different from the way he talked at me the first time we met. Also palatable, or would be palatable, but in a different way. Originally, the shtick was business and entrepreneurial success. This time it was psychedelics and spiritual awakening or self-knowledge in the face of this natural event. He was talking about taking mushrooms and understanding deeper aspects of the universe and all the shit I am normally interested in hearing about and discussing. And all I could think was, that's really very good. If I didn't know exactly what you are, I would buy that. Because the only reason I know what you are is that I know what you are. Because even right now, knowing what you are, none of my alarm bells are ringing. If anything, my interest bells are ringing. And if I hadn't, in the last year, and especially in the last 4 months, emotionally hardened or deadened, whatever you want to call it, I would probably be needy enough, desperate enough for connection, I would ignore my knowing and get roped into whatever this is. Because I am still needy enough to feel that want, despite my knowing, despite the deadening. I still feel it. And what is this? What was this encounter? Well, I think it was a few things. One, that my little secret safe space is not secret and not safe. I have never encountered another person in that spot, at least when I'm there. And I think it was a chameleon flexing. An orchestrated, careful chameleon flexing. I can blend in this well, and you know who I am. But the key point here is that neediness. How needy are you? How many times do you have to get fooled and slaughtered before you get a handle on it? Because it seems like every time I give in to that emotional neediness, it's a setup for something. And that makes me think about living in a world like this. To be safe, not just emotionally, I mean literally, physically safe, you need to keep your guard up 100%, 100% of the time. And still interact with people, but with those safeties. But that's a very lonely existence. And that neediness, that emotional neediness is still there. But if you lower your guard even a little bit, people will always take as big a chunk out of you as you allow them to, or afford them the opportunity to. So if you keep your guard up, you feel that emotional need. But if you lower your guard, you get mauled. And getting mauled is worse than feeling lonely. And that's one of the reasons I respect my boss, and I try to keep that connection to the respect level, not to the emotional level. And it's because he kept it at the respect level, in spite of my emotional neediness. I was trying to be friendly with him, and he recommended we not get very close. Appreciates what I do as an employee, but probably shouldn't be buddies. And he's right, because being buddies invites problems. People are designed to rip each other apart. You can't afford to trust anybody like that. And dealing with a normal psychopath, I think, has been useful in learning that. Because you learn not to interpret a lack of internal alarms as an indication of your being okay to trust someone. Most humans are going to do you the favor of letting slip what they are before anything bad happens. That's why you enter the world and feel bad all the time, which you should do. You need to learn to feel bad. You don't go out into the world to see that people are great. Maybe that's why you initially go out into the world, because you were stupid enough to believe what people say, but you actually go out into the world to see what people are like. And most people will do you the favor of letting you know what they are in advance. But there are people out there who are so proficient in deception, you can't trust your own instincts. You need either to know what they are beforehand and trust your knowing over your neediness or lack of alarms, or you need, if you don't know, to keep that guard up at all times. Because there are people who can and will slip in, and you won't be able to detect them until it's too late. But operating on that level is so lonely. Or lonely is the wrong word, right? Because when you think lonely, you think someone sad, alone, oh, I wish people were around. When it's more like isolation. If there were a word that infused isolation and strangulation, that's more what operating on that level feels like. You are in a cabin, in the dark, fog all around like dark wood. You hear shit outside, speaking in human voices that you know are not human. That motherfucker is not real. You can't go outside, and there's no one you can turn to for help, and you know it's only a matter of time before you slip up and they figure out a way to get in. It's like that small but key difference between 95% and 100%. You can walk around operating at 95% and not feel that level of acute isolation strangulation. You are allowing yourself a little bit of wiggle room to trust and to hope. And that 5% is enough for a demon, a ghost from the woods, to come in and get you. So you have to upgrade yourself to that 100%, but when you do, it's like you're holding your breath. You can't keep it up all the time. It starts driving you crazy. Again, there's a difference between saying trust nobody and meaning, feeling, and living don't trust anybody. And feelings are weird because I've felt two separate things recently. A few days ago, for about 30 minutes, I felt okay with everything. I am at home, I'm playing a game, and although everything is wrong, I feel okay. And that feeling is strange to me, because I'm wondering if that's the way most people feel most of the time. And if it is, how do they do it? Because it wasn't a triumphant feeling. It wasn't a happy feeling. It was just the absence of bad feeling for a little while. And I didn't make that feeling happen, yet it happened despite the way I normally walk around feeling. So you can be what you are and somehow still feel okay with everything. You have no control over it, but those natty gains are achievable. And you contrast that feeling with how I felt earlier today. I feel back to the normal level of bad now. General pain, discomfort, stomach badness, shortness of breath, feeling like you're gonna fall over or something. But I haven't felt like I needed to scream in quite some time. But earlier today, I'm just standing there feeling like I need to scream. Like inevitability got its hands around your throat. It feels like, imaginary, you're in a submarine and you realize you're in a submarine. You are underwater and you can't get out. Or real life, it feels like you are in those shackle things, like the hand and ankle cuffs. You think mind over matter, that's not going to affect you. All you are in shackles, you can't move, so what? But then you're actually there, you realize you're there, you realize you can't move physically in your own body, and you are encompassed by a system that wants to traumatize you, and it takes everything in your power not to lose it. And that's the normal emotional extreme of dealing with modernity. Slowly but surely upping your defensive measures and mental fortitude, getting some results, but understanding you are ultimately at the mercy of the universe, but still keeping your hands on the wheel until you realize, like Lovecraft, cosmic horror, realizing just how powerless you are, how inescapable your reality is, and stepping onto that ledge of losing it. The way I am learning to live is the antithesis of how I was raised to think I should live or even could live. And you can wrangle yourself back down with time, just give yourself time to let that terror pass. You tell yourself there's the way things should be and the way things are. And that is a good tool for bringing yourself or bringing your hands back onto the wheel. But even if you say that, and that's why I view coping mechanisms or phrases, whatever, as having a shelf life that you're going to think your way into expiring, is your feelings or your thoughts about the way things should be are the way things are. Your feelings and thoughts about the way things should be and could be didn't come out of nowhere. They are part of reality. And that loops us back into feeling okay despite everything. That feeling of okay comes out of nowhere, but it does happen sometimes. And you don't have to ignore anything, you don't have to talk yourself into it, you don't have to repress your knowledge, your experiences, whatever. You can have all of those things and sometimes still feel okay and completely sober. What is that? Well, it makes me think a bit about Apocalypse Now and Far Cry 3. Willard has tentatively crept his way into becoming one of my favorite characters. He says and does a few things related to this feeling okay in spite of the horror thing. Two phrases here, maybe we'll add more as we go on, but to start, don't get off the boat unless you're going all the way, and you won't learn anything about yourself in a fucking factory in Ohio. Willard is interesting because despite being the main character, he's mostly an observer. And he ends up sort of accomplishing a mental state or achieving a mental state Kurtz couldn't handle. Now, Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now by extension, but primarily the little novella by Conrad, is still written about extensively in academia. So I'm not here trying to decode the message because there isn't a message to decode. I'm also not speaking from a place of deep experience. I am just using the idea generator as an amateur here. One of the reasons Kurtz snaps is his inability to achieve individual, high-level moral doublethink. Lower-level doublethink isn't that hard, but it isn't actualized doublethink. Most of the PBR crew have achieved this low-level moral doublethink. As Willard says, we chop them in half with machine guns and then give them band-aids. Chief forces them to stop the boat, instigates the murders, the massacre, and then hates Willard for finishing it out. Finishing what they started. They got off the boat, he went all the way. And they hate him for shooting the woman after she's already basically dead, because his seeing what they started through forces them to confront what they started. But because they haven't actualized that level of doublethink, they use him as a scapegoat. If they would have initiated it and then actually tried to get this woman they've murdered to a medic somewhere, somehow, which is just totally unreasonable, they would have maintained their low-level conception of reality. They're acting in a contradictory or doublethink type manner, but on a low level they don't understand. Whereas Willard, in that instance, is operating at a higher level. We either don't stop the boat, or we do stop the boat and see it all the way through, recognizing it for what it is, but not on that doublethink level. Willard still views it as one or the other. Taking option A, which is less gruesome, more humane, but not duty-bound, or taking option B, which is duty-bound and gruesome and seeing that gruesomeness all the way through. One or the other. Kurtz, and I love Apocalypse Now, in his letter to his son, or his message to his son, through Willard, I don't think he'll understand what I've attempted to be. Kurtz has attempted to make A and B the same. Getting off the boat and going all the way, but not feeling horrified, disgusted, or angry, dehumanized, basically, the way the PBR crew does. Horror and moral terror. If they aren't your friends, they are your enemies. True enemies. They are the PBR crew's enemies. When confronted with the reality, the ultimate reality of what they're doing, stripped back, duty stripped back, they can't handle it. Willard, at least in that instant, can see that horror and moral terror and choose to engage in it fully or choose to avoid it fully. To become a demon by doing it, or to become a human or stay a human by not doing it. Kurtz is trying to see that horror, that moral terror, all the way through and still be a human. It is really like the end of 1984. Seeing something and believing it. From one perspective, you can't do both. From another perspective, somehow you can. Kurtz attempted to be that, and it broke him. It's almost like The Fly. Putting the two things together doesn't necessarily synthesize. More often than not, you're going to turn into an unrecognizable horror. Because putting those two things together doesn't synthesize them. In fact, you probably aren't supposed to be able to synthesize them. But sometimes you can. Somehow. That's Willard by the end of Apocalypse Now, I would argue. Lance, too, actually, but in a different way. Lance synthesized, and although he's still present physically, mentally it's like he underwent ego death. And one of my favorite theories about Lance, it's funny, it's so stupid, but it makes so much sense. I read in a comment section, when Lance puts on his woodland camo face paint and says, "Face paint, so they can't see me," that's when he synthesizes, undergoes ego death, and spiritually becomes one with nature once he puts on that nature face paint. And that's why he survives. It's because people don't kill him because they can't see him. Because in spirit, he's no longer present. He is part of the jungle. That's how he survives. He's invisible. He's as invisible and indistinguishable as another tree would be. And that's so stupid, but I think that is what happened. It's just perfect. God, I love that movie. Whereas Willard synthesizes where Kurtz couldn't, where Kurtz put the two things together and broke as a failed amalgamation, and Lance synthesized but disappeared. Willard synthesized and kept his hands on the wheel. Willard achieved Chim. Lance zero-summed. Kurtz charmatted. Willard, the contradiction, the participant observer, succumbs, truly succumbs, to horror and moral terror without losing himself. Willard can go back to the real world. He can descend back to the mortal plane. Somehow. I haven't worked out what separates Willard from Lance and Kurtz. And this is why this synthesis is so tricky. Because on paper, Willard should not have been the one to have synthesized. It should have been Kurtz. Kurtz was far and away the superior soldier, superior human being in every way. But Willard is the one who synthesized. I don't get it. And I think that's the fact that it can happen and it doesn't make sense is why it's important to our context, even though we're going to be working this out for a long time. And then we think about Far Cry 3. In my opinion, the only Far Cry formula game that actually made good on the formula that game established. In my opinion, and let me be a hipster for a second, I was a Far Cry 2 fan before it was cool. Far Cry 3, or in my opinion, Far Cry, is not just an interesting location and an interesting villain. It is also a character who becomes shaped by that location and that villain, which is something none of the other Far Cry games, as far as I know, have achieved. Brody, through constant exposure, warps himself. And I think one of the reasons Far Cry 3 was so potent was it came out... Maybe it's a generational thing. Far Cry 3, for me, was the first FPS that let you grow in... It's like a style shooter by the end. You start coming out of the COD era, playing it like a COD game, and end up brutalizing people. Endgame Far Cry 3 is vicious. When that game first came out, and by the end, or as the game was going on, I realized what was happening, Jason Brody made me uncomfortable. And reflecting on it, I think part of what generates that discomfort is typically when we think of psychosis or mental illness, we think of it as a bad thing. But Brody is an example or an instance of adaptive positive psychosis. You watch him lose his mind in real time and become more gruesome as you level yourself out, and it's constantly commented on and criticized, but if Brody hadn't lost it, they wouldn't have survived. If they survived. I don't know what the Far Cry canon is, but to my mind, staying on the island is the true ending. Nuckin' futs Jason Brody living on the murder islands forever. And he develops this weaponized psychosis by exposure and need. At first, Brody needs to kill. By the end, Brody has learned to love killing. And he's gotten uncomfortably, yet stylishly good at it. So, from Apocalypse Now, we take this moral doublethink, the concept of synthesizing normality, like a normality anchor, and horror and moral terror. Knowing it is possible somehow to do monstrous things and to be a monster and still to be human and feel okay about everything. It is somehow possible to do both. And then we take Far Cry 3, adaptive psychosis, needing to do monstrous things until it becomes pleasure. And then we apply those two concepts to learning never to trust anyone. 100% power. Constantly feeling sick. Constantly shitting liquid. Constantly feeling short of breath. Constantly just wanting to lie down and not wake up. Constant terror of your reality, your species, the people you're among, the creature you are, the creature and society you can't escape from without dying. Yet, that moment, that 30 minutes of, despite all of this, without repressing any of it, without using any substances, feeling okay in spite of all of it. And then something theoretical comes into view. Your possible synthesis, your possible adaptive psychosis. You might have it in you to reach a point you look at everything, reality, your species, yourself, and to say none of these things are okay, but still feel okay. From most points of view, that should be impossible. But on some level it is possible, because you felt that 30 minutes of everything is okay. Somehow it happened, briefly. You briefly understood 2 plus 2 is 5. Do you have it in you? Could you possibly, via enough exposure and immersion to these awful things, mind break yourself, glitch the matrix, to operate at the highest level with full knowledge of how fucked everything is, how awful everyone is, how awful you are, no repression, and feel like all of that is okay? I think maybe. My fingers are crossed. I think it's possible to develop a finesse and a taste for this reality, but you have to transform. And I don't know how, when, or why that transformation happens, but I think it can. Not saying it will, but I think it is possible. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.